There was a time when a man who loved his wife showed it quietly, through sacrifice, through showing up, through staying even when it was hard. But what happened on the Family Feud stage on a Thursday afternoon in October 2023 was anything but quiet. A husband stood at a microphone in front of a live studio audience and said something to his wife that nobody in that room expected to hear. Not Steve Harvey. Not the producers. Not the hundreds of people watching from the bleachers. And certainly not the woman standing just a few feet away from him, the woman he had been married to for 19 years. What came out of Marcus Webb's mouth that afternoon could have destroyed everything. Instead, it became the moment that saved his marriage and reminded an entire nation what real love is actually supposed to look like. Before we get into the full story, if you are new to this channel and these kinds of real, powerful family moments speak to you, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe right now. We bring you stories like this every week. Now let's talk about Marcus and Sandra. Marcus Webb was 52 years old, a former high school football coach from Memphis, Tennessee, who had spent the last decade working as a logistics supervisor at a distribution warehouse. He was the kind of man who woke up at 5 in the morning without an alarm, who coached his son's youth baseball team for 8 straight seasons, even after his son grew old enough to stop playing, and who still opened the car door for his wife every single time they went somewhere together. People who knew Marcus used the same words to describe him over and over: dependable, steady, loyal. He was not the most talkative man in the room. He was not someone who expressed his emotions easily or often. He had been raised by a quiet father who showed love through action rather than words, and Marcus had inherited that same quality. He fixed things around the house without being asked. He remembered every anniversary and every birthday. He worked overtime when the family needed extra money and never mentioned it at the dinner table. Sandra Webb was 50, a pediatric nurse who had worked at Lebonhir Children's Hospital in Memphis for 22 years. She was warm, organized, deeply faith-filled, and the kind of woman whose coworkers came to her with their personal problems almost as often as they came to her with medical questions. She and Marcus had met at a church retreat in their early 30s, fallen in love over 2 weekends of volleyball and bad barbecue, and gotten married 14 months later. Together they had built a life that looked, from the outside, like something most people would envy. A home they owned, 3 grown children who called on the weekends, a close, knit community at their church, 19 years of marriage, and a Christmas card photo that genuinely reflected a happy family. But there are things that Christmas card photos never show. And what they never showed for the Webb family was the slow, quiet distance that had grown between Marcus and Sandra over the previous 3 years. A distance neither of them had talked about directly, but that both of them felt every single day. Marcus had been dealing with something he had told no one about. Not Sandra, not his closest friends, not even his older brother, who was the person Marcus trusted most in the world. He had been silently struggling with depression. Not the dramatic, bedridden kind that announces itself loudly, but the grinding, low-level kind that makes everything slightly heavier and makes a man who is already quiet become even more withdrawn. He had stopped initiating conversations at home. He sat in his recliner after dinner looking at the television, but not really watching it. He said everything was fine when Sandra asked, because he genuinely believed that admitting otherwise would make him look weak. Sandra, for her part, had interpreted Marcus's withdrawal differently. She did not know about the depression. She knew only that her husband, the man who used to reach for her hand during church, who used to suggest weekend drives just to have something to do together, had stopped reaching. She started to wonder if the love had simply faded. She started to wonder if 19 years of marriage had quietly become 19 years of habit. She had not said this out loud to anyone either. She was a woman who had spent her entire adult life caring for others and did not know how to frame her own loneliness as something that deserved attention. So both of them carried their separate silences into the Family Feud studio that Thursday afternoon, dressed in matching burgundy outfits, smiling at the camera, and completely unaware that the next hour was going to change their lives. The Webb family had been invited onto Family Feud by Marcus's youngest sister Diane, who had submitted the application on the family's behalf almost 8 months earlier as a birthday surprise for Sandra. The lineup was Marcus, Sandra, Diane, Marcus's brother-in-law Terrence, and Sandra's cousin Patrice. 5 people who loved each other and had no idea they were about to witness something that would shake all of them. The taping went smoothly through the main game. The Webbs were good competitors. They read the audience well, cheered each other on, and moved through the rounds with the kind of easy team chemistry that only comes from people who genuinely know each other. They won the main game and earned their spot in Fast Money. The plan was for Sandra to go first and Marcus to go second. Sandra stepped up to the podium, took a deep breath, and answered her 5 questions with a steady 139 points. The audience applauded warmly. She stepped back, and Marcus stepped forward. Steve Harvey, as he always does, spent a moment with Marcus before starting the clock. He asked him where he was from, how long he had been married, what he did for work. Marcus answered each question in his characteristic way, direct, short, no embellishment. Steve got a laugh from the crowd with a joke about Memphis barbecue, and Marcus smiled genuinely for the first time since walking onto the stage. Steve looked at him for just a moment longer than usual and said, "Man, I can tell you've got a lot going on behind those eyes. You look like a thinker." It was a small, offhand observation, but something about it, the directness of it, the accuracy of it, visibly moved Marcus. He looked down for just a second and then back up. "You have no idea," he said quietly, and the microphone caught it. The audience laughed, thinking it was part of the usual pre-game banter. But Sandra, standing just off to the side, heard the weight behind it. She looked at her husband and saw something in his face she could not immediately name. The Fast Money round began. Marcus needed 61 points from his 5 answers to win the 20,000 prize for the family. He was focused, deliberate, and scored well, 78 points. The Webb family had won. The studio erupted. Diane grabbed Sandra in a hug. Terrence and Patrice jumped up and down at the back of the stage. But Marcus stood at the podium very still. He was not jumping. He was not pumping his fist. He was standing with both hands flat on the surface of the podium, looking at something in the middle distance that nobody else in the room could see. Steve Harvey noticed immediately. He walked over and put a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Brother, you just won your family, 20,000. Where are you right now?" Beat 4. Time pressure. The confession builds. Marcus turned and looked at Steve. Then he looked at Sandra. Then he looked back at Steve. And then, in front of the audience, the cameras, the production crew, and his entire family, Marcus Webb said the thing he had been unable to say for 3 years inside the privacy of his own home. "I need to tell my wife something," he said. His voice was completely steady. "I've been meaning to say it for a long time and I keep not saying it, and I think if I don't say it right now, in front of all these people, I might go another 3 years without saying it." The studio went quiet with the kind of attention that happens when everyone in a room simultaneously senses that something real is happening. Steve Harvey, to his enormous credit, did not deflect or redirect. He simply said, "Then say it." Sandra had stepped closer without realizing it. The other family members on stage had all gone still. The audience was completely silent, even the production crew. The people whose job it is to stay detached and keep the show moving had stopped moving. Marcus turned to face Sandra directly. He cleared his throat once, and then he told the truth. He told her that he had not been present in their marriage for the last 3 years. Not physically absent, but mentally and emotionally absent in ways that he knew she had noticed and that he had refused to acknowledge or explain. He told her that he had been depressed, that he had struggled with it quietly and alone because he was afraid that if he admitted it, she would see him as less than the man she had married. He told her that his silence had never been indifference, that pulling away had never meant falling out of love, that he had been so deep inside his own head, trying to manage something he did not have words for, that he had let the most important relationship in his life quietly starve, and that he was ashamed of that and sorry for it, in a way that went deeper than he knew how to express. He said, "Sandra, the brutal truth is that I haven't shown up for you the way you deserved, and I knew it the whole time. I just didn't know how to fix it. I still don't completely know how. But I know I can't keep pretending it isn't happening. Beat 6. The breaking point. Sandra had tears running down her face before he finished the second sentence. Not the kind of tears that come from being hurt. Though there was some of that too. The kind that come from recognizing something you have been carrying alone for so long that having someone else finally acknowledge it feels like putting down a weight you forgot you were holding. She put her hand over her mouth. She looked at her husband. This man she had worried was no longer in love with her. This man she had slowly been grieving while standing right next to him. And she saw something she had not seen in a long time. She saw him. Not the performance of him. Him. Steve Harvey stood between them and said nothing for a long moment. And then, softly, he said, "Sir, do you know how rare it is for a man to do what you just did?" See, Steve Harvey has been in the entertainment business for 30 years. He has interviewed heads of state, performed for sold-out arenas, and sat across from people in some of the rawest moments of their lives. He is not a man who is easily caught off guard. But he stood on that stage and looked at Marcus Webb with something that every person in the studio could see clearly: genuine respect. He turned to the audience and said, "I want everybody in here to understand what just happened." This man could have taken his 20-year Zalozend and walked off this stage. Instead, he chose his wife. The audience responded with applause that grew quickly into a standing ovation. Steve let it go for a full 30 seconds before he raised his hand for quiet. He turned back to Marcus and Sandra and said, "Come here. Both of you." They moved toward each other and Steve stepped back slightly, giving them the space but staying close enough to hold the moment. He asked Sandra, gently, if she wanted to respond. Sandra wiped her face and took a breath. When she spoke, her voice was steady in the way that only happens when someone has been waiting a long time to say something and has rehearsed it without realizing it. She said, "I thought you stopped loving me. I really did. I was lying in our bed at night wondering when it had happened and trying to figure out what I had done wrong. I never." She paused. "I never once thought you were hurting. I was so focused on what I thought your silence meant that I never thought to ask what it was actually about." She looked at him directly. "I'm sorry I didn't ask. I'm sorry I assumed the worst, and I'm grateful. I am so grateful that you finally said something, because I don't want to live another day in that house thinking what I was thinking." Marcus reached out and took her hand. It was the simplest gesture in the world, but Diane, standing behind them, later said in an interview that it was the first time she had seen her brother reach for Sandra in longer than she could remember. And seeing it, that small, deliberate act of reaching, made her cry harder than anything else that day. Steve Harvey composed himself visibly before speaking again. He looked at the couple and then at the audience and said, "This is what it looks like when two people decide to stop protecting themselves and start protecting each other instead." He paused. "Marcus, what made you do it today? Of all the days and all the moments, why today?" Marcus thought about it for a moment. Then he said, "Because I was standing in front of my family, and I had just won something, and all I could think about was everything I had been losing at home. And I thought, if I don't say it now, when the stakes feel real, I never will. I've been waiting for the perfect private moment, and there is no perfect private moment. There's just now or not at all." Steve nodded slowly. "Now or not at all," he repeated. "Somebody write that down, because that right there is the most honest thing I have heard on this stage in years." The Webb family gathered around Marcus and Sandra on the stage. Diane, Terrence, Patrice. In a group embrace that was not choreographed or performed. It was the kind of hug that happens when a family collectively exhales after holding its breath for too long. Several audience members were openly crying. A few of them later said they had thought about their own marriages the entire drive home. Resolution. Lesson. Community impact. Universal application. The episode aired 6 weeks after taping. Within 12 hours of broadcast, the clip of Marcus's confession had been shared over 2 million times across social media platforms. By the end of the week, it had reached nearly every major news and lifestyle outlet in the country. The comments sections were filled not with the usual noise of the internet, but with something far more unusual: people sharing their own stories. Men wrote about depression they had never spoken aloud. Women wrote about marriages they had quietly been grieving. Couples wrote that they had watched the clip together and then sat up talking until 2 in the morning about things they had left unsaid for years. Marriage counselors shared the clip with their clients. Pastors referenced it in sermons. A university professor of communications included it in a course on vulnerability and interpersonal honesty. Steve Harvey addressed it directly on his talk show the following week. He spoke for nearly 10 minutes about Marcus and Sandra Webb, not as a television moment, but as an example of something he believed most people were desperately hungry for: proof that honesty between two people who love each other does not have to be a weapon. That the truth, when it comes from a place of genuine love and accountability, can be the most generous thing one person ever gives another. He said something that week that would be quoted extensively in the coverage that followed. Marcus Webb stood in front of the whole country and told his wife the truth about himself. Not to get sympathy, not to make excuses, but because he loved her enough to stop pretending. That is not weakness. That is the bravest thing a married person can do. For Marcus and Sandra, the road that followed the broadcast was not immediately smooth. Marcus began seeing a therapist 2 weeks after the taping, something he had resisted for years and that he later said he should have done much sooner. The process was uncomfortable and slow, and there were sessions where he came home feeling worse before he felt better. Sandra joined him for couples counseling sessions every 2 weeks. She was also processing her own things, the loneliness of those 3 years, and the guilt she felt about having misread her husband's pain as rejection. Their therapist, speaking generally about couples in similar situations, noted that one of the most common and destructive patterns in long marriages is the mutual silence that forms when both partners are hurting but neither wants to burden the other. Each person protects the other from their truth, and in doing so, both people end up completely alone inside a shared life. The Webbs had lived inside that pattern for 3 years. What Marcus did on that stage was break it, loudly, publicly, and irrevocably. 6 months after the episode aired, Marcus and Sandra were interviewed together by a Memphis-based television station. They sat side by side on a couch in their living room, and the difference between the couple in that interview and the couple who had walked onto the Family Feud stage was visible. Not because everything was fixed. They were careful to say it was not. But because the posture between them had changed. They leaned toward each other. Sandra touched Marcus's arm when she wanted to emphasize a point. Marcus looked at her when she spoke, not at the floor. Sandra said in that interview, "People keep asking me if I was embarrassed that it happened on national television, and honestly, no. I was relieved. I had needed to hear those words for so long that I didn't care who else heard them. I just needed to hear them." Marcus said, "I've had men reach out to me, strangers, men I've never met, and tell me they saw themselves in what I did. Men who are sitting in their own houses right now feeling the same way I was feeling and not saying a word about it. And I want those men to know the silence doesn't protect anybody. It just postpones the damage. Say the thing. Whatever the thing is, say it." The response to that local interview generated enough attention that Marcus was eventually invited to speak at a men's mental health awareness event in Nashville. He was not a polished public speaker, and he said so openly at the beginning of his remarks. But the room of 300 men listened to him for 40 minutes in near total silence, and when he finished, several of them were in tears. One man, a 58-year-old retired firefighter named Gerald, came up to Marcus after the event and told him that he had watched the Family Feud clip with his wife on a Friday night, and that by Saturday morning he had made his first appointment with a therapist, something his wife had been asking him to do for 11 years. "I just needed to see another man do it first," Gerald told him. "I needed to see that it didn't make you less of a man. It made you more of one." Diane, Marcus's sister, who had originally arranged the Family Feud appearance, gave a brief interview in which she said that she had cried for 2 days after watching the taping, not because she was sad, but because she had watched her brother, the quiet, steady man she had known her whole life, find words for something that had been locked inside him for years. "I always knew Marcus loved Sandra," she said, "but I didn't know if he knew how to show her. Now he does." Sandra's cousin Patris, who had been on the stage for the entire moment, said simply, "I have been to a lot of family events in my life. Weddings, funerals, graduations, birthdays. That afternoon on Family Feud is in the top 3. And it was a game show," she laughed, which tells you everything about what kind of moment it was. 1 year after the episode aired, Marcus and Sandra renewed their vows in a small ceremony at their church in Memphis. It was not a large event, just family and close friends, the same people who had watched them build their life together over 2 decades. But the ceremony was different from their original wedding in one meaningful way. This time, when the minister asked them to say what they wanted to say to each other, Marcus spoke first. And he spoke at length. He was not short or direct or brief. He talked for nearly 5 minutes about his wife, about who she was, about what she had meant to him through the years when he could not say it, about what it had cost him to stay silent and what it had given him to finally speak. Sandra said later that it was the finest speech she had ever heard in her life, not because of the words themselves, but because of the man delivering them, the man she had almost given up on believing would ever let her all the way in. Steve Harvey, when he heard about the vow renewal, sent the couple a handwritten note. Sandra framed it and hung it in their hallway. It said, "Marriage isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about 2 imperfect people who keep choosing each other, even when it's hard, even when it costs something, and especially when the truth needs to be told. You 2 did the hard thing. Keep doing it." The story of Marcus and Sandra Webb has been shared in marriage retreats, counseling practices, church small groups, and university classrooms across the country. It has been held up as an example of what emotional honesty actually looks like in practice, not as a concept or an aspiration, but as a real messy, terrifying, and ultimately healing act between 2 real people. What Marcus said on that stage was called a brutal truth in the headline, and it was hard. But the real lesson of this story is that the truth was only brutal because it had been held back for so long. Said sooner, with the same love behind it, it might have been a quiet conversation on a Tuesday night. The brutality was never in the truth itself. It was in all the years of silence that made the truth feel like an emergency by the time it finally came out. Marcus Webb went to Family Feud to win a game. He walked off the stage having won something far more valuable, his wife back, fully and for real. And Sandra Webb, who had driven to that studio wondering somewhere in the back of her mind whether her marriage still had anything left in it, drove home that night with her husband's hand in hers and an answer she had needed for 3 years. Steve Harvey, who has spent 3 decades on stage and has heard every kind of human story there is, said it as plainly as it can be said, "The bravest people I have ever met are not the ones who have no fear. They are the ones who say the thing anyway." Marcus Webb said the thing, and it changed everything.